You are.
Brooks, are you ready?
Almost, yes.
Almost?
Yeah.
Like a couple of seconds?
I am now ready, yes.
All right. Check that mic for me.
Hello?
All right, let's hear that piece in 3, 2, 1. Begin.
Barman's eyeballs ping-ponged between him and his passport, a fake. Don Juan de los Espejos and Alma Solamente. The barman said, not asked. Juan nodded even so. How he'd gotten to the bar was by drifting aimlessly with the apathy of unblown smoke. In other words, he'd moved without real intentions, sans desires, a style made redundant perhaps by the atmosphere of smoke extant inside. Why he'd come been more complicated. Juan had a sickness of the self by his own diagnosis, an interminable case of the blues. For a while, he'd occupied his time with disastrous attempts at locating the cause of his ill, with the search for a cure. Fruitless though, and grown despondent, Juan devoted himself anew to the practicality of treatment, and the blues, like all metaphysically transmitted diseases, would be treated most effectively with drinking and darkness. Incredulity apparently holstered, a barman poured Juan 2 fingers and left him alone to medicate. State I'm in, though, Juan had thought, it's gonna take several hands. The potion rapidly paled his ailment to shade approximating robin's egg. When, scanning the barroom mirror, he'd seen the girl pass by behind him. Eyed her backside also. Felt his heart leap. His eyes had followed too, then to where she'd merged with the beaded curtain at the back of the room and disappeared. Avalanche of misguided logic that then it identified her to him as a true cure, or else an acceptable projection of same, and he compelled to follow. Juan's mind had been boggled, first to discover that what had been the dive had opened deceptively into a cavernous black box theater, and surprise doubled when finding a near crowd in attendance. The girl, presumably lost among it, undaunted by this late fact, or steadfast in pursuit, wanted half-loped aisles, scrutinized dimmed faces, gathered via ambient chirps and burbles the nature of the act, an impressionist. An internal groan been displaced by the sight of her at the far end of a row. He took a seat at the end opposite and fine-tuned his gaze. He'd coveted her for how long when the curtain had finally rose? Something new in her eyes then. He detected a chaste second gaze, all her own, not for Juan, but the impressionist. Juan had been crushed there by her unintentional betrayal. How could she? Those eyes, for an impressionist? Slew of mouthed vulgarities followed his inquiry. Tricked then by the familiar blue-stained logic that got him there into concoction of an ill-advised course of action, he confused love for a girl viewed from a distance. He'd had to have her notice him, and so decision been to memorize the affectations of the impressionist. And so then, night in / out, he'd return to the bar, to the theater, to case the impressionist. No luck though, as time gone by and she'd not noticed him even once. Begun to feel as though his efforts were in vain, Juan had, when someone else did notice. The impressionist approached him, tone tinged with respect or suspicion, Juan couldn't tell which. But after some probing, had offered Juan his offer to understudy. Instant's hesitation, maybe, less, before Juan had accepted. Weeks progressed then, though not Juan. Private lessons with the impressionist had been undermined by hidden and conflicting interest. Impressionist's emotional reaction, multifaceted and similarly conflicting. Touched to have found a passionate protege. Bewildered when passion failed to invoke talent therefrom. Frustrated finally. Truth's realization dawned on him slowly, but he'd known something, been askew, when Juan somehow botched a walk-in into a Gottfried. Impressionist had been steamrollered by calamity in that moment. Reality had been that he'd contracted Juan's blues, or some form of compounded. He'd become imprisoned in melancholy, became paralyzed by grief. Show must go on had been the house manager's response, though. A glance tacked to the end, or else seemed to have been the implication. The dilemma had sealed Juan's fate then, hopeless where impressions concerned, panicked and endowed him with a strange clarity, briefly, distorted glimpse also into the heart of emulation. The only avenue left to him had been to impersonate the impressionist, not to mimic but to be. Gamble here paid off as well. His performance had been essentially identical to the night's past so far as the audience is discerned. Girls gazed, conveyed an imperceptible skepticism though. Juan sensed she'd sensed an imperfection. But then she tolerated the hoax at least as it were. Stretch of time had passed, during which Juan not simply assumed his rival's character, but eclipsed it. Method he'd vanguarded elevated a histrionic craft into a mimetic art. Unprecedented ticket sales validated his meandering spectacle. Meanwhile, cult following that had begun to form referred to him as a human mirror, nicknamed him the replicant affectionately. Only each step Juan taken toward perfection paradoxically signaled a decline in the girl's affection. Juan had noticed. Contradiction incited a type of madness in him then. All sorts of stunts and gimmicks had been added to his set. Motivation had been to woo the girl, of course. First experiment had been with impersonations of impressions of outlandish people. Cartooned personas delivered soul-shifting monologues in dead languages. Even once managed to have spoken at length with a prelingual infant. Soon thereafter, he graduated to non-human models, intricate transfigurations according to vaporous geometry his body'd undergone. He'd catted and dogged, cattled, snaked and snailed, frogged and fleed, wailed and cocked, even flowered immaculately. Girls' attendance had grown intermittent, however. On nights she'd not shown, Juan subjected the audience to an avant aggression. Impressions of inanimate objects and esoteric, abstract constructs shows had been comprised entirely of. Time he'd seen her next confrontation been inevitable. Approached her with questions of her one-time enthusiasm and how could it have diminished now he'd come so far. A thoughtful pause before her reply had been verbatim. Put it this way, it used to be when you became someone else, there was always this fragment of personality that remained, some unimpeachable token would linger. The real beauty of the performance was that dissonance. It was uplifting to know that two distinct yet complete psyches could coexist within one body, neither contaminating the other. Now, when you disappear, it's into a vacuum, into oblivion, and there's nothing left. Impersonator had been dumbstruck then, and when he pressed her as to why she'd kept coming back, a shrug communicated that optimism had been both stubborn and unbearable. Impersonator had been indignant. Fuck.
Brooks Finnie. Ladies and gentlemen, Brooks Finnie.